Welcome everyone to this episode of Manufacturing Talk Radio. I'm Jim Grady here with Lou Weiss, who is president of All Metals and Forge Group, trying to look very corporate there in his yellow jacket. And we're always excited to have a discussion with Dr. Chris Kuehl on the Flagship reports because he adds levity to a situation that is not particularly comfortable called the economy. Chris, thanks for joining us again.
You're so welcome. Yeah, usually when you think of humor and mirth, economics doesn't come to mind instantly. Yes.
I don't think they have a lot of stand-up comics doing economic stuff, do they?
That's really a shame. You'd think that Ben Stein would have started a whole genre of economic humor, but so far he's kind of unique in that respect.
Well, we'll see if we can get you a spot on Saturday Night Live.
There you go. I just want my own Visine commercial. I mean, that's what I'm after. So
Okay, so where are we at, Mr. Doctor?
Okay, well, the subject of the day, of course, is are we in a recession? Are we headed for one? What is a recession anyway? So not to belabor and make people feel like they're stuck on Econ 101 again, but the challenge for the United States is that we almost never have a 100% recession, just as we never have a 100% boom. We're a big, diverse economy, and at any given time, you're going to see part of the economy doing very well and part of the economy not doing very well. And even when we're in a position of looking ahead at downturn or recession, and remember that the classic definition of downturn, recession, etc., is that it is a downturn if your neighbor loses their job. It's a recession if you lose your job. It's a depression if the economist loses their job. So we're not yet at a depression level, thank goodness. But we're looking right now at sectors that are suddenly doing quite well. You talked about the Flagship and some of the other things that Armada does, and we can talk about that in more detail. But one of the critical studies that we do is the intelligence system. And in last month's iteration, you saw aerospace completely reverse. A sector that was doing this is now doing this. And you're suddenly seeing pretty significant growth in aerospace. Automotive is still growing. And what triggered the change in aerospace was relatively recent. I mean, the aerospace sector had convinced itself that the business traveler was gone forever, that everyone was going to work virtually and they were never going to go to the office again, and they weren't going to travel and they weren't going to go to conferences. That abruptly changed in sort of the summer and early fall of this year. And I could see it just in my own travels and going to the conferences that I attended early in the year. They were maybe 60, 70% of what they had been. Now they're 10, 20% higher than they have ever been in terms of attendance. Early in the year, I'd look at the plane and it was overwhelmingly leisure travelers, people in pajamas, people that hadn't bathed in days, whatever. I would frequently be the only person on that plane wearing a suit. Lately, it's the suit club. There are several of us, in some cases, multiples, and the business community is back on airplanes. And because of that, the airlines are suddenly adding routes and they're expanding, they're flying more, which is driving the aerospace sector. Right now, it's driving it around parts. So the Boeings and the Airbuses and all the various tier 1, 2, and 3 suppliers are frantically trying to keep up with the demand for parts because they're flying the planes more often and they're breaking down and they need to be repaired, but they're also seeing advanced orders. So it's hard to definitively say, hey, we're in a recession. Well, not if you're in this sector. But what sectors are suffering? Well, anything that is highly sensitive to oil prices, because those have gone up considerably. But then you look at aerospace and say, but aren't you sensitive to air prices? This is yeah. And we've raised our rates, but the business people don't care because they're the ones who are saying, yeah, well, whatever. airfare is higher, but the boss is the one that's sending me. So he's paying for it. Why am I sweating it? Um, so it's just kind of interesting. We're probably going to come out of this quarter with some growth, very, very slight, probably 0.3, 0.5%. We may slip back into a negative stance in the fourth quarter, depending on what consumers do. But the projection for 23, by the time we get to the third quarter of 23, we're back to 2.5, 3% growth. So if we are getting indeed a downturn, it looks like it's going to be a pretty short one and one that will begin to reverse even as soon as the second or third quarter of next year.
So let me just ask you a question after all that gobbledygook.
You bet.
Are we heading to a recession or not?
No, I mean, I really don't think we are. I mean, and again, it just depends on how you want to define it, because and I don't want to turn into a media basher, but the media has a tendency to oversimplify. They try to take a very complicated subject and reduce it to a soundbite. So you get this like several months ago, we've had 2 quarters of negative GDP growth. We're in a recession. We're all going to die. It's like, well, no. The arbiter of all things recession is the National Bureau of Economic Research, NBER. NBER has repeatedly stated that we look at 26 variables, not one. So yes, GDP numbers went down in the first and second quarter. Employment didn't. We didn't see a reduction in capacity utilization. Industrial production is still up. Capital spending is still up. Those are all things that would say, no, you're not in a recession. But on the other hand, we did have the GDP drop for 2 quarters. We do have high inflation. We do have a reduction in the number of jobs on offer. Well, so we are having a recession. No. And it's like you have to help people parse it and try to figure out where the I mean, I just gave a talk not 2 hours ago for a bank in South Dakota. And you've got concerns around the country in some places around employment. Not in South Dakota. The unemployment rate in South Dakota is 1.3. I mean, if you can fog a mirror in South Dakota, you can get a CEO's job.
Are you including cattle and rams and all of that in that one?
That's what they have done in South Dakota is that the smarter cows are getting jobs now. So if you can if you've got cows in IT, it really is true. So
So I won't ask if we're in a recession, but I'll flip it. Are we in an expansion?
again, it depends a little on your sector. Automotive, clearly. Automotive has been taking advantage in a weird way of the supply chain collapse because the demand built up so high during that period that now virtually every vehicle that's coming off the line is pre-sold. You've had this tremendous backlog of consumer demand. If you're looking at sectors that are a lot more sensitive to consumer spending, particularly those that are kind of appealing to the under 50K earner, they're the ones who have been hurt most by the inflation, and they're the ones who are beginning to suffer from recession fear. So there's definitely angst in that group, but the people who are making over 50K are kind of at the I want to complain about inflation but spend anyway. I mean, I go to these hotels that are sponsoring all of these conferences, and these are big, fancy resort hotels in many places, and they're packed. And so I was talking to one of the managers, and I said, "Are you seeing any decline?" And he said, "Nope. We were booked solid for a year." And I said, "Are these all like really well?" No, he says they're families. They're just people that are going to go on vacation. They didn't go on vacation in 2020. Many of them didn't go in 2021 either. And by God, they're going to do it now. And I mean, we're talking $500, $600, $700 a night hotels, and they're full, absolutely full. So there's, like I said, there's worry in certain sectors that are more sensitive to where the pricing has been aggressive, and the inflation driver is still probably the number one thing we're looking at as far as recession, because as long as the Fed is raising interest rates, It's designed to put the brakes on the economy. But even that's complicated because the only kind of inflation the Fed can really deal with is demand pull. This is the kind of inflation that comes when there's more demand than the suppliers can meet. And then you're trying to dry the money supply up so there isn't as much demand. The inflation we're dealing with now is cost push. It's being driven by expensive inputs, by expensive fuel, by expensive parts because it's hung up in the supply chain. And it's just, and the Fed admits, and the other central banks agree, we don't have a lot of impact on cost push inflation. We can raise interest rates, but it's not going to change the supply chain. So it's, as many of you know, I once upon a time was a Soviet guy, studied to be a spook back in the day. And the Soviet Union was always very proud of the fact that it did not have inflation, ever. Prices never rose in the Soviet Union, and they didn't because they controlled demand and supply by simply not having anything. So here, it's like, wow, the price of food has gotten very expensive. And the Soviet Union was, no, it is not expensive. There's simply no food at any price. It's like, but what if I'm willing to pay? Too bad, no food. No food for you. But 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 I want it. It's too bad we don't have. So that's one way of controlling demand. Just don't have anything.
So all that being said, Chris, the ISM came out with a number this week, beginning of October, and the number has gone down
Mhm.
again. And as of today, we saw the number for the machine tool order index,
Mhm.
which also shows things are gone down. And that number doesn't mean anything today, but it does mean something about 4, 5, 6, 7 months into the future.
Right.
So we may not have a recession today, but there's things happening.
One of the things, and I don't know if many of the listeners have had an opportunity to see it, but you can send me an email and I'll send it to you. Our strategic intelligence brief has been showing the same curve for the last several months. And we kind of divided it into three parts. Part one was all the expansion that was going on in 21, even into the beginning of this year. And this was when lots of purchasing was being made and companies were putting in new machines, putting in robots, putting in automation, building up their inventory. Well, they kind of finished that process about first quarter of this year, if not even the last quarter of 21. So then our chart shows this big drop and it's plunging down to levels maybe not as bad as 2020 by any stretch, but considerably lower than they were. But then this chart shows it coming back up. And the very latest version of this, that plunge became a little bit shorter and the recovery started a little sooner, was a little bit flatter than it had been before. That by the time you got to the end of 23, third or fourth quarter, you were back to levels that were reminiscent of 2019, 2018. So there's one big contingency that is sort of hanging over that recovery. This is assuming that the inventory that has been built up in the last several months will indeed be consumed in the coming 2 or 3 quarters. And it assumes that companies will respond with more machinery orders, with more turning to robotics. The two things that are driving those assumptions, there is $3.5 trillion still in the hands of the consumer. They still have a significant amount of accumulated savings that they haven't spent. Are they going to spend it between now and the end of the year? Maybe. Or maybe they will hang on to it because they're a little worried about what 23 looks like. But that wad of money is a potential driver to eat up that inventory. The other concern and the reason that companies will continue to do machine purchasing is the labor shortage. And there's absolutely nothing to suggest that that labor shortage is coming to an end. I get asked all the time, what can we do to solve the labor shortage issue? And I said two things. It's really quite easy. We changed retirement age to 83, which if we used the same demographic tables they used in the 30s to set retirement at 65, retirement today would be 83 because they set it at 65 because we were supposed to die at 66. It was kind of like, we're going to help you out for about a year, but then you better dang well croak. We're not going to make this a second career. So like, we're going to work you to death and pay you for a few months. The other thing we could do to rapidly change things is eliminate child labor laws. Most of the IT experts are 9 years old anyway. So it's just like pull them out of the basement and say, do something useful instead of playing Doom. Help daddy figure out how to go off mute. So,
Well, Chris, one of the other things in the economy, the other surprises, like we're all watching what's happening in Ukraine, and and there's a big question: will Russia use nukes or tactical nukes? Which I doubt, because it would elicit a bad response. But any other surprises out there that we should kind
well,
of?
probably the two biggest things, and they wouldn't necessarily qualify as a response or a reaction or even a surprise, but the media was all over the place the last week or so because the Saudis and OPEC have decided to cut production, not radically, but a significant cut. And this was immediately interpreted as the Saudis are pro-Russian and they don't like the United States. And it's like, well, no, actually, please quit being a doofus and understand that the oil producers are interested in one thing, money. I tend to be a sort of conservative economist, and my motto is follow the money. If you want to know why people are doing something or not doing something, figure out who's making money and who's not. The oil producers want to defend $80 a barrel oil. That is their sweet spot, anywhere between 70 and 90. They look ahead and they're saying, if indeed there is a slowdown, and there will be, whether it becomes a full-blown recession is a matter of semantics, but there will be a slowdown. So they assume that production needs to be cut in order to meet this reduced demand. So the decision to reduce output is simply saying, hey, look, we think people are going to consume less next year. And as a result, we don't want to be overproducing. They remember oil prices dropping to 20 bucks in 2020. They don't want to see that again. So it has nothing to do with the Saudis liking or disliking the Russians. They just like money, and they're interested in protecting their interests, as do all the oil producers. The US producers, Canadian producers are still going full bore because they are anticipating pretty solid demand both here and because the US will be continuing to supply the Europeans. The other thing that's not really a surprise per se, but something to watch, we've kind of taken our eyes off China to a degree, but the situation in China is a lot more fluid than we give it credit for. We sort of look at Xi Jinping as like near to a potentate or a dictator, all in control. That's never been China. China's run by a Politburo of about 8 guys, and these people, collective leadership still exists. The number 2 man in China is Li Keqiang. Li Keqiang wants desperately to be the number 1 man, and he has been criticizing Xi literally every day in the Chinese press, saying, you are screwing up this country with your stupid COVID policy, which is ruining our economy. And oh, by the way, Chairman Xi, why are you irritating the country that buys the junk we make? Who do you think buys all this stuff? Walmart is not full of German or Dutch or Australian. It's full of Chinese stuff. Quit hacking off our biggest customer. And there's a lot of support within China for Li's position, even within the military. One of the things I learned as a Soviet guy was to figure out where people stood as to their power, whoever they stood next to. And for the first few years, the head of the Chinese military always stood to the right of Xi Jinping. For the last several months, he has stood to the right of Li Keqiang. So it's kind of like, Chairman Xi, if you continue to make mistakes, you may have to retire for health reasons. In other words, if you don't retire, you will have health reasons.
So, Chris, you bring up the military, and I'm wondering how Russia is doing in Ukraine. Because despite a few wayward attacks on Kiev, they seem to be still really struggling.
Oh, they're struggling in ways that are just unimaginable. And it's just, if you could pick the stupidest decisions one could make, they're being made. I mean, you couldn't even make this stuff up. A few weeks back, one of the incidents showed what the Russians are up against. 3 of their big tanks were blown to smithereens by a drone, which is no big deal. Drones do that. Except within the investigation, it was a $50 Radio Shack drone that was flown by a 13-year-old Ukrainian girl who had strapped dynamite to the bottom of it with duct tape and then flew it into the tank, which was carrying fuel. It blew the tanks to smithereens, and then she scampered on home. And the best part about it, it was her brother's drone. So it's like, it's
And
just,
she's being considered a national hero.
oh, of course. I mean, so, and it's just, and then Putin decides to institute conscription and he starts drafting people. But then, being the megalomaniac nitwit that he is, he decides to go after his minorities. So he was dragging in Dagestanis and Chechens and Yakuts. Chechens, you're drafting Chechens. This is the part of Russia that you annihilated 10 years ago, literally reduced Grozny to rubble, and you're now drafting these people into your army. There was an incident not a week ago where 20 or 30 Chechens allowed themselves to be drafted. Everyone was surprised. As soon as they got to their base, they turned around and killed all the Russians at the base. And they said, "Thank you so much for the weapons. This makes it so much easier to kill you," which we've been trying to do for a very long time because we Chechens hate you. Thank you for drafting us. Good move, lad. Man, that military is just on the edge of utter collapse, as is the country. Russia has set itself back 25 years. And that's something that is going to reverberate long past whatever end of this war we get, because Russia is almost permanently sidelining itself when it comes to energy production. All of that investment that was going into Russia to build their manufacturing sector, all of it stopped. So it's very, very awkward for the West for the next probably 9 months to a year as we wean ourselves off what we got from Russia. After that, Russia is a broken, has-been state, and it would surprise me if Putin was still in control. The discussion right now is some kind of a soft coup where a military junta basically takes control, leaves him as a figurehead, and says, do what you're told, or it will take the next step. Because the Russian generals are not happy that 100,000 Russian soldiers have been lost already.
You too will retire for health reasons.
Yes, exactly. It's like, we are thinking you have very bad cold. So, time to rest.
So being that we're talking about war and peace, they ought to name a book about that.
They should. I bet it'd be a really big one, very long.
Yeah, big, tall.
Yeah, yeah.
So what's your thought on what's going on between China and Taiwan, and how is the US really going to be involved or not involved? I mean, is this a real issue, or is this another figment of somebody else's imagination?
It's kind of a diplomatic thing, but an interesting report that came out from the Chinese military, and this was just a couple months back when all of this was going on. They issued a report which was actually made public that said, if it came down to it, the Chinese military easily defeat the Taiwanese. We could take over the island. That's not a problem. The issue is, what would the reaction be? And if the United States decided to impose sanctions the way that it has on Russia, we need to be aware, and this was from their own military, we need to be aware that we are only 20% independent when it comes to soybeans. We rely on the rest of the world to feed us. 80% of our soybean consumption comes from outside China. And the report was pretty blunt because at the end it said, in the last 2,600 years of Chinese history, every government in China that has fallen due to food riots. And the military said, if we do not feed ourselves, the military will be spending most of its effort attacking other Chinese, putting down food riots. So, kind of hinting, if you want to pressure Taiwan economically, if you want to do diplomatic stuff, be my guest. But if you actually provoke the world to cut us off, be aware of the fact that we're going to have to attack our own people because the Chinese population is very sensitive to starvation.
So we're going back to the phrase earlier in the show about no food for you, eh?
No food for you. Exactly. I mean, it gets just be very basic. I mean, to make matters worse for China, they're experiencing very serious droughts. The Yangtze River is not flowing as it should, which is cutting into hydroelectric power, but it's also cutting into their food production. So you've got a combination of worrying about what might happen with sanctions, with the fact that even domestic production is not what it should be. And China has always been very susceptible to these outbreaks, kind of where COVID came from. Periodically, they have these big swine flu epidemics where they end up having to destroy 80% of their pork population. And so China is always very aware of how vulnerable it can be when it comes to food. Now, on the other hand, we're very vulnerable to what we purchase from China. I mean, we import $50 billion worth of stuff from China every year. And we're trying to find other sources, but that's not automatic. But you can see that the entire world is beginning to, the big conversation now is friend shoring. If you're going to produce outside your country, do it in a country that doesn't hate you. So right now, I'm convinced that if the U.S. wants friends, first you have to have a war with them, and then they like you. I mean, the country that likes us most in Asia is Vietnam. And it's like the Vietnamese remind me of Ally McBeal shows, like that guy that used to say bygones. You know, it's like the Vietnamese are like, yeah, I know it was a war and it was a mess and you killed a lot of people, but you left this really cool port behind, which you built to hold aircraft carriers. It holds container ships really well. So
All
I don't know, Tim. I'm feeling rather depressed.
right. Well, Chris, I was going to ask you about uh, China attacking Taiwan. Isn't China also heavily dependent on the Taiwan semiconductor industry, and that would be a bad plant to blow up during the attack?
well, it certainly would. They're not so much as dependent on the Taiwan semiconductor business as they are dependent, oddly enough, on us. We have a very strange relationship to the semiconductor world because we still design the majority of the semiconductors, whether they're memory chips or anything else. We're still the country that does the most design. We don't do production. We let the production leave because that was the kind of scut work of semiconductors. You know, back in the day, it was done by legions of people sitting on an assembly line. Now robots do more of it. So what we're trying to do now is regain some of that production capability. The new export controls that were put in literally last week now prohibit Chinese companies from using the technology and the design that's coming from the US without an explicit export license. And needless to say, China is going to struggle to get those licenses. And the rest of the world, the Japanese, the Koreans, the Taiwanese. But even if you look at how Taiwan Semiconductor is reacting to all this, they were in the process of building a new facility and they were going to build it in Taiwan. But then all of a sudden they said, you know, maybe we should build it someplace that the Chinese are less apt to bomb. How about Phoenix? So they're building their new facility in Arizona. And Samsung is like, we could do that in Korea, but no, I think we'll do it in Texas. So Samsung is building their new facility in Texas because they know that even if the United States didn't attack them, Texas would. You know, Texas it alone has the sixth largest air force in the world.
Oh my goodness.
That's shocking.
I mean, it's just kind of like Texas is like, do you really think we stopped being an independent country? We just pretend that we're a state. We were an independent nation. We really still are. And we're actually prepared to secede with about an hour's notice. And so
Do you think Governor Abbott will get in one of those jet planes and fly away?
well, he'll probably, I mean, it's just it's like I said, they probably have a master plan where they can actually physically detach from the United States. And so
They're going to reroute the Rio Grande all the way around the state. We're
yeah,
done here.
exactly.
Yeah.
Well, it sounds like things are strong. I just want to remind our viewers and listeners that Armada Corporate Intelligence, which is Chris's company,
It's
produces
an
two,
oxymoron, I know.
it produces two reports. One's called ACES, and the other is called the Flagship reports. And I have to tell you, these are so bargain basement priced for the top quality content. You really ought to become a subscriber, Chris. I love the reports.
Yep, I agree. The Flagship comes out Monday, Wednesday, Friday. It's usually around 7, 8, 9 pages long, and it sells for the same price as a Starbucks caramel macchiato per month. So it's $7, and you will get the wit and wisdom of myself and my business partner, Keith Prater. And the ASIS is something else that we produce monthly. And we've actually broken it down now into its component sectors. So if you're interested in the overall manufacturing sector, you have the whole thing, but you can also just say, hey, I'm in automotive. That's all I care about. I'm in aerospace. I'm in electronics. I don't really care about the other things, and you can just buy those as well. So if you are interested, I urge you to go to our website, which is cleverly called www.armada-intel.com. So ARMADA-intel.com. And for those of you who haven't heard the story, and I figure now is as good a time as any to explain where we came up with the dumb name. 23 years ago, my business partner and I were in a bar, and we currently had been working for a marketing firm that was tanking because the owner was an idiot. And we were trying to figure out what we were going to do with our lives. And he said, let's start our own company. And we'd had several beers, and so we convinced ourselves this was a good idea. We thought really it was going to last about a week, but we had to name it. And there was a big picture of a ship over the bar. So we said, let's just call it Armada. Like, who's going to care? No one's even going to know we ever existed. And so suddenly we became Armada. And ever since then, we've been trying to tell people, no, it's not Amanda. It's not Armando. It's Armada, like the Spanish Navy. And by the way, here's your joke of the day. Why does the Spanish Navy have glass bottom boats? So they can see the old Spanish Navy. So yeah, Spanish don't find that amusing, but that's where Armada comes from.
Well, speaking of the Spanish and the French, and how is Europe doing?
Badly. Europe is in recession, and this is something, again, it probably won't last much past maybe second or third quarter of next year, but that's highly dependent on what happens with oil and gas and energy. The Europeans have to get through this winter. If they can get through the next 4 or 5, 6 months, then they're in pretty good shape to kind of divorce themselves from the Russian dependency, but they've got to get through the next few months. If it's a particularly cold winter, it's going to be problematic because they're going to have to come up with a lot of money in order to ease the sting. The country that's probably in the best shape is France. France still has a lot of nuclear power to rely on. It never gave up nukes. The country in the worst shape is Britain. Britain is really reeling. They're probably going to go into the most serious of the recessions. Germany kind of in the middle, but they're basically just kind of holding on and watching the weather broadcast. We are supporting Europe as best we can. Much of our diesel is going to Europe. We're selling them a lot of LNG, but there's a limit to how much we can counter. After spring, you start to see new supplies of gas coming in from Libya, from Algeria. Qatar is developing a brand new gas facility, which is going to be making Qatar the second largest gas exporter in the world, behind only the United States. So Europe is within shouting distance of some recovery, but they've got 6 or 7 rough months to get through.
But we still have Saudi Arabia to rely on.
Oh, don't we ever? The Saudis, the bad news is that the Saudis are extremely oriented towards making money. The good news is the Saudi Arabians are really oriented to making money. So at the end of the day, the Saudis are like, well, we're going to do things that irritate you because we're going to be protecting the price of oil. On the other hand, we know that you're the country that buys a lot of our oil. So we will reverse those production decisions when we think there's a profitable reason to do that. And they always have. It's also useful to know that the other Gulf states are not as supportive as they used to be. So if you start looking at the conversations coming from the UAE and from Qatar and from Bahrain and from Kuwait, they don't really work in lockstep as they used to. Like Kuwait has not agreed to reduce production yet, and Qatar is doing the same thing. Bahrain is negotiating with the U.S. to host a naval base. So there used to be more unity within OPEC than there is now. There always were outliers like Nigeria and Venezuela. And you have a lot of countries that aren't even members of OPEC. Canada's not, Mexico's not.
Well,
Right.
the only good news that I really heard this week was that NASA succeeded in diverting the asteroid 4% that way.
Right.
So that's
You
good.
know, that's good. I mean, we don't want to get hit with space junk. That's always a good thing.
Yep.
More than anything else, we don't want to have our lives depending on Bruce Willis again. So it's just it's like
Yeah, this
Bruce
this
is
will be the rock they divert that hits a different rock that comes back at us.
yeah,
So
exactly. The asteroid will probably collide with Jupiter and send it hurtling towards us. It's kind of like, okay, now we have a problem. So,
I'm curious, Chris, after Nord Stream 1 seemed to have some unpredicted issues, that Russia offered gas through Nord Stream 2, which Germany has not yet approved. Does anybody care?
at this point, there's kind of a lot of diplomatic back and forth because the Russians keep cutting off supply. They only really have one tool left with which to influence Europe, and that's energy. And they keep trying to put more and more pressure on Europe, hoping that there is some kind of cooperative behavior. The Russians have always counted on the European population tiring of all of these things and turning on Ukraine. This might have happened if Ukraine was steadily losing. But what's been going on is that the average European is like, the Ukrainians are kicking these guys in the teeth, and we're not prepared to abandon them. And the Ukrainians are maintaining that popularity in Europe, even as people are paying much, much higher prices. And every time there's a little bit of success, it encourages those who are supporting Ukraine. realizing that it's not just a matter of sending them weapons, we've actually sent them effective weapons. The Russians have absolutely no answer to the HIMAR. And this is devastating Russia. This is that mobile missile launch platform. Russians can't find it. They can't shoot at it because it moves. And those things are laser targeted. So once you launch the missile just goes until it finds you. So it's like, I'm going to hide behind the rock. And the missile says, no, you're not. I see you behind the rock, and I'm going to blow you and the rock to smithereens. So you can't run from it. I mean, it's just, and they're trying to make these HIMARS as fast as they possibly can in order to keep supplying Ukraine. And then the Ukrainians will pull off something that's pretty low tech, like take a truck bomb and blow up the bridge to the Crimea. It's like, okay, isn't this what they tried to do with the World Trade Center building? Uh-huh. It's not exactly a new technology. You pack a truck full of stuff that explodes, you put it in the middle of the bridge, and
Boom.
there you go. So,
Now that's going to affect Russia's supply line and
oh, tremendously.
ships in that they've docked in in the Crimea.
Yeah.
That's got to have a nasty long-term effect.
Well, it does. I mean, it isolates that part of, I mean, Russia really thought that we would have a repeat of the 2014 invasion of Crimea because Russia went in, took the Crimea. Everyone said that was a bad thing to do. Nothing we could do about it. So we put it on their permanent record and moved on. And they were sure that this would happen again, that they would take over Ukraine in a couple of weeks. We would go, tut, 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 that's not very nice, and then accept it. Because honest to God, if you look at what's happened since the kind of collapse of the Soviet Union, the notion of Ukraine breaking up would not be unusual. I mean, many of these countries did that. Czechoslovakia made no sense as a country, so it amicably split. The Czechs didn't like the Slovaks don't like the Czechs, so they said, rather than fight a war, let's just split. You have your country, we have ours. Meanwhile, there's Yugoslavia, which was 10 years of civil war because it was not a good idea to put together Serbs and Croats and Slovenes and Kosovars and all that stuff. Western Ukraine has nothing in common with Eastern Ukraine. They haven't for decades. And if there is any sort of negotiated end, it may very well be this accepting that these are two countries and that the Western side will form Ukraine, the eastern side will either end up part of Russia or like Belarus, kind of a satellite state. Ethnically, politically, that's kind of how the country has split over the years anyway. The big contest is over the south. Who would control Odessa? Who would control access to the Black Sea?
And then last but not least is one of Lou's favorite, South America. How are they faring?
Well, South America has gone almost completely to the left, and Brazil is about ready to bring Lula back to power, not as easily as he thought it was going to be. But you've got left-wing regimes in Colombia, which used to be to the right, Peru, Chile, Argentina, Brazil. I mean, there's not really a center or right-wing government left in Latin America of any significance, but you have some very ridiculous policies. I mean, Argentina is one of the most dangerous places in the world for an economist because it is illegal in Argentina to mention inflation. So if you call
Okay.
attention to the inflation in Argentina, you can be arrested and put in prison.
Well, we have a
So
guy in Florida who says you can't say the word gay.
that's true. And if you say gay inflation, oh my God,
Oh,
you know, you're probably really doomed. But quite literally, economists who are trying to report on Argentina have to go to Uruguay to say it and then realize they can't get back in the country because they're considered a threat to something. I have no idea. You know, it's like I'm simultaneously outraged and excited because I'm outraged that you can get in trouble for saying inflation, but I'm excited that anybody cares what an economist says. It's like, really? We're that important? Wow, I had no idea. Most countries just ignore us.
Well, then we have the other issue with South America, and that's where it's the home of crime.
Well, theoretically, yes. I mean, it's there's an awful lot of, again, that kind of media shorthand where you just have these reports that make things look as miserable as they can possibly be. The people that live in the area say, well, yeah, there's a lot of crime because we've got 50% of the population living in poverty and they steal food from each other. So it's an area where you've got a lot of government imposed desperation, and this has always been a challenge. I mean, it's you see so many decisions that just don't make a great deal of sense. It's a very striated society. 10% of the population has 95% of the wealth. You know, we have the distribution issue in the US, but nothing compared to what you see in many of
Yeah,
these
I was
emerging
just going to
markets.
ask you, were you talking about the US or South America?
Yeah, we're still not quite at that level, but we know the difference too. I mean, we have segments of the population that are a lot more vulnerable. We still have a substantial middle class, fortunately, but a lot of these countries don't. I mean, it's poor or rich and nothing in between. The area that's getting a lot of attention now is Africa, because Africa has kind of gotten to where China was 20, 25 years ago. Population size, almost half the population of Africa is under the age of 30. It is highly educated as compared to where it's been in past years. That's both blessing and curse. The good news is they have a lot of educated people. The bad news is they don't have jobs for them. So they're either going to be losing them to migrating elsewhere, or they're going to become very frustrated and demand change. But you've got some very fast growing countries in Africa that are sort of picking up where that supply chain crisis has gotten people thinking alternatives. They're moving to Botswana, to Ghana, to Namibia, to Mozambique, places that used to be Rwanda is one of the fastest growing countries in Africa and has kind of left the genocide years behind.
Well, that's certainly an improvement. I love watching what's developing in Africa because they're the next up and comer that's going to be a great place to source from if the United States can catch on to that at a pace to catch up with China.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is that because we've had so many people come to the US from Africa, that creates a diaspora that can go back to Africa with the skills and the contacts they made here. I mean, I had a driver that was helping get me from Denver to a conference in Vail. So we had like 2 hours to talk in the car there and back. He's a mechanical engineer from Ethiopia, and he's working here to kind of get his family settled, but he's got plans already to go back to Ethiopia and get involved in a couple of big construction projects, assuming that they can kind of control some of the civil wars going on in Ethiopia. That's a big if, but he's an example of somebody that is highly trained, now has experience and contacts in the United States. And if things calm down enough in Ethiopia, then he can go back and say, hey, I know how to build, and I've got construction contacts back in the States. And you see that kind of thing. I had the same experience in Dallas. My Uber driver is an urban planner from Laos. And it's like, well, he's learning urban planning here, but he still wants to go back home at some point to Laos and help build his country.
Fascinating.
And it's going
Fascinating.
to be quite a chore.
No kidding. But when we look at things like when the Eastern European countries began to break away from the Soviet Union, one of the reasons Poland came out so fast and developed an economy so fast was the massive diaspora of Poles living in the United States. I mean, for years, there were almost daily flights from Chicago to Warsaw full of people from Poland or who had ancestors in Poland bringing their expertise, bringing their money, and you could just see it. I mean, it was just every time you turned around, there was a new business that was being put together by who? Well, a Polish guy from Chicago whose grandparents or parents immigrated to the US, and he says, yeah, but I'm still in my heart a Pole, and I want to go back and help Poland.
Well, this is why we enjoy talking to you so much, Chris, because you can answer all of our questions that we've thrown at you over the years, and we look forward to chatting with you in a month or so on more new and some old subjects.
You're very good, and I'll come up with yet another set of obscure countries. You know, it's like,
I think
what's happening in Lesotho?
First, you have to know where that is. But there are 2 continents in the world that we have not spoken about. So I'd like you to think about it over the course of the next month. That's the Arctic and Antarctica. So you think about it.
Exactly.
And check out
I
their
will.
economy.
We'll talk about the ants of Antarctica and maybe the uncles too. You never know. So
Okay. All right.
thank you, gentlemen.
For all those who've enjoyed this episode, we urge you to check out these reports from Armada Corporate Intelligence. You can find this show at jacketmediaco.com along with our other podcasts. And again, thanks for joining us on Manufacturing Talk Radio.
Thank you, gentlemen. Till next time.
Till next time. Bye-bye.